During your presentations in Connect, you might choose to leave your participants' microphones disabled while you or other presenters are speaking. This cuts down on idle chit-chat or distractions during the presentation, but there are often times when a participant has something useful to interject into the presentation or has a relevant question. They may even want to bring something technical to your attention, such as the fact that you forgot to turn on your own microphone and no one can hear you. Fortunately, even with audio for participants disabled, there are still tools for them to be able to get your attention. For instance, the chat pod is one way for them to send a general message out to you or to the other attendees, but you may not have the chat pod open. So one tool that's always available to the participants is the Set Status button found up here in the menu bar. Now, I'm currently logged into this meeting in another browser as a participant, so you can see how this works from both sides. So let's say this participant is watching the presentation I'm giving, and he wants to ask a question. Notice there's no microphone button here in the menu bar that the participant can enable to speak. Instead, he clicks the Raise Hand button. Notice that puts the Raise Hand icon next to his name here in the Attendees pod. Now, back in my view as the host, I see this message that one person has raised his hand. I see the person's name, and I can either accept or cancel the hand raise. If it's not a convenient time, I could click the X button to ignore the hand raise, and that would clear his status in the Attendees pod. But if I want to hear what he has to say, I can click the checkmark button, and that changes the icon next to his name in the Attendees pod to a microphone, and that indicates that he now has microphone privileges. And sure enough, if I switch back to the participant's view in this other browser, there's now a microphone button in the menu bar that he can click to speak to the group and ask his question or make his comment. Now, as the host, if I feel that I've answered his question or that he's had enough time on the microphone, I can roll over his name and choose to disable the microphone again. Now, hand raising doesn't just have to be used for your participants to ask questions or to get your attention. You could take advantage of the status tool as the host to get information from your audience. For instance, I might ask something like, how many people here drive a hybrid car? Click your hand raise button if so. And you can see the hand raises start coming in, and the hand raising icons will appear next to anyone who clicks that button here in the Attendees pod. Not only that, but you can also sort your attendees by their statuses by clicking this button here, Attendee Status View. That lets you easily see who in the group has raised their hand. Notice there are other status types listed here when you switch to this view in the Attendees pod. You also have Agree, Disagree, and Stepped Away. If I click the drop-down arrow next to the status button, you'll see there are actually several statuses participants can use to indicate their status or to communicate with you. They can choose a status to request that you speak louder or softer, that you speed up or slow down, and they can even indicate laughter or applause, which is especially nice when you can't hear your audience. The status items at the top are the ones that can be viewed and sorted in the Attendees pod if they're selected. For instance, you can ask your attendees if they agree or disagree with something you said, and then sort the pod to see their answers. For instance, I'll select Agree here, and you can see my name has now appeared here under Agree, and there's a green check mark. Or attendees might set their status to Step Away, which you might want to instruct them to do so you don't call on them to answer a question or to provide input while they're not there. Now, if you find that you've been answering a lot of questions or that your attendees have all types of statuses set, you might want to reset things just to clean the Attendees pod up a bit. To do so, go to the Options menu and choose Clear Everyone's Status. Also, if some of the attendees still have their microphones enabled, you'll also find an option here to remove audio rights from all, which will disable all your participants' microphones, and then you can re-enable them as you need or want to. Now, in cases where you're presenting and you don't want to accept or be bothered by hand raising at all, you can go to the Meeting menu and open Preferences, and here under the Attendees pod category, you can disable Raise Hand. That way you won't see those alert messages that pop up when you're presenting because that button will be disabled for all the attendees. They'll still be able to set other statuses like Agree or Disagree or Speak Louder, and those icons will show up in the Attendees pod, but you just won't be bothered by that overlay message saying someone has raised their hand. And you can always come back in here and re-enable hand raise after your presentation. So again, there are other tools for communicating with your audience like the chat pod or the Q&A pod or the poll pod, and we'll look at each of those later. But the status button is a great tool for your attendees to quickly indicate that they have a question or a comment without you having to make a specific pod available.